It's hard to believe that right now we're in the year of 2025. And of course, at the beginning of the year, everyone started to talk about this AI revolution. And some believe that the way AI is going to truly change our world by automating enormous amount of intellectual work that was once done by humans. And three things will drive its ability to do that. Everyone we talk about AI product is confident that tons of innovation to be achieved in how we interact with AI and how we check the work and also to set the agenda as long as the AI can work with us. There's no denying that technology is going to simplify our life. However, when we talk about international relationships and also foreign policy, we don't know if AI is able to be on our side. And given the fact today that AI is very complicated, and also the foreign relationships are complicated as well. In the year of 2025, not only that we pay attention to what's happening to the West, and also it's crucial we need to understand the war in Ukraine. Some experts believe that as in less than 10 days, we're going to see President-elect Donald Trump is going to return to the White House, they also can determine the fate of the nation of Ukraine and also the war in Ukraine. How do we understand this relationship between Ukraine and US at this moment? And do we believe, and when we say we as an international community, believe that Donald Trump has the power or even has the authority and the empowerment to end the war and even to restore the relationship between Ukraine and Russia? How do we unpack everything? Well, in this episode, we are going to talk about all of them. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is Dr. Alexander Motyl. Dr. Motyl is a professor of political science at Rutgers University-Newark, and he's a specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and the USSR, and he's on nationalism, revolutions, empires, and theory. He's the author of 10 books of nonfiction. Well, Dr. Motyl, and welcome back to The Missing Piece, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you and to all your listeners and watchers, and thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Absolutely, the honor is all mine. Now, Dr. Motyl, I want to get started. Recently, that you wrote a opinion piece, and regarding one of the fascinating topics, it's about Putin's belief in God. And the title called, Does Putin Believe in God? And this is what you wrote, and I want to get started on our conversation. And you wrote, and I quote, "So does Putin really believe in God? If one considers that just about everything he utters it's a lie, then the answer would have to be no. Putin fashions himself as the savior of Russia and the world." Now, Dr. Motyl, you are the expert. Let's talk about this. Why do you think it's important that we look at this relationship between Putin and the religious perspective? And what does that mean that he fashioned himself as the savior of Russia and the world? And again, we're looking at the complication of the war. And there's a possibility that President-elect Donald Trump is able to put strategies or even put a solution to this war. But how do we understand that Putin's motivation to be the savior of the world and Russia, and also in this religious perspective? Your thoughts?
Well, let's start with the second point, namely that he thinks of himself as being the savior of Russia and the world. That's been clear for the last 25 years, and it's been especially clear in the last 5 or 10 years, where he's positioned himself as quite simply the savior. And of course, once you say the word savior, you're immediately, indirectly invoking the image of Christ, or Allah, or any other God, in whichever world religion one considers. So the question naturally arises: is this simply an ego trip for Putin? And it clearly is that, or is there more to it than just that? I personally think that he's being very cynical. Someone with his life career, a tough kid who grows up on the streets, joins the KGB voluntarily. It's like joining the Gestapo voluntarily. and is committed fully to the Communist Party, which was by definition and by declaration an atheist organization. It strikes me as being very, very, very unlikely that he's genuinely a believer. Well, for a number of reasons. One is the Orthodox Church in Russia is powerful. Its patriarch is alleged to have been a KGB agent, so that would make an alliance between the two very, very attractive. It supports the war, and in turn, Putin had been supporting the church. At the same time, a significant number of Russians are religious, and in playing up to this religious theme, Putin is obviously extending a hand to them and saying, look, I'm on your side. We're both believers. God has appointed me as the savior. And some Russians actually do think of him as their savior. So there are all sorts of reasons, mostly cynical, mostly political, for his playing this religious card. As I said, I'm very strongly persuaded that he doesn't really believe. We can't prove that, of course, but nothing in his record would suggest that he's sincere. He does go to church services. He lights candles. He crosses himself. He goes through the motions. I don't think there's any serious concern with the essence of Christianity. And then when you consider what Christianity claims to be about, like most world religions, it's about loving your neighbor. It's about living in peace. It's about not committing sins, refraining from violence and war. I mean, these are the essence of just about every world religion. And Putin, as you know, is practicing the exact opposite. He's committing wars. He's committing genocides. He's arresting and persecuting his political opponents. He's having them murdered. This is not the kind of behavior that any kind of religious person, whether a Buddhist or Muslim or Christian or Jew, would consider to be consistent with their with the religious beliefs.
Dr. Motyl, again, we talked about this previously regarding that he is a believer in military operation. And I think this is something that you also mentioned in the article as well. And this is actually what you wrote. And then I quote, that Putin may be sincere in believing that God supports the special military operation. But how could he possibly know, unless, of course, God speaks directly to Putin, perhaps while he's sleeping or the sleep of the monstrous guild? Now, Dr. Motyl, why do you think that today, again, we don't know the outcome of the war, but we are seeing the reality that no one is actually on the winning side at this moment. So in other words, when we're looking at the war, the special military operation or the presence of the military operation can escalate the war in a much greater way. So why do you think that Putin today, he still is thirst for military empowerment, and also he's still hungry to empowering the military operations? So does that mean that he's actually sending a strong message to Ukraine and also to the West, and to say, hey, listen, I don't know if I'm going to win the war or not, but when it comes to military, I have endless people and I have endless ambition, and most importantly, I am not going to stop using the military operation or operating the military authorities in order to get what I want. So what does that mean when we talk about his ambition as in military?
Well, clearly he wants to win, and hence he's applying military pressure. What winning means has become unclear. If you look at the rationale for his invasion back in February of 2022, winning meant essentially removing the government of Ukraine, replacing it with a puppet regime, neutralizing the country, demilitarizing it, and effectively making it into a colony of Russia. In effect, over the last 3 years, Putin has succeeded in exactly the opposite. The Ukrainian government of Mr. Zelensky has become more patriotic than it used to be. It's committed to Ukrainian independence. Ukrainians across the board are committed to independence, sovereignty, freedom, and the return of their occupied territories. In other words, what Putin has done is not to weaken Ukraine and thereby make it into a colony of Russia. He's actually made it stronger. Of course, at the same time, he's devastated the infrastructure. We know that. But in doing so, he's essentially increased the Ukrainians' commitment to their identity, to their sovereignty, and to their nation. So he's attained the exact opposite. He is now in a pickle, and he has a problem, because to give up the military operations would essentially mean to admit defeat. But to continue is essentially to engage in a form of activity that will never really result in victory. One of the points you said is that there's something like a stalemate. It's not clear who's winning, who's losing. In point of fact, Russia is losing. Ukraine isn't exactly winning, but it's almost winning. But Russia is losing. And again, it's something that a number of analysts, including myself, but they were first in pointing this out. If you look at Russian losses, there are roughly 1,500 dead or wounded soldiers per day. That amounts to something like 45,000 in a month. And those are the kinds of casualty rates that the Russians have had over the last half year to a year and a half. At the same time, if you look at the gains that they've made territorially, they're tiny. When you look at the map, especially if the map is enlarged, it looks like they're making fantastic advances. But in reality, Russia has seized something like 0.5% of Ukrainian territory. And at the rate they're going, they will capture Kiev in 92 years. That gives you a sense of how far they still have to go in order to make significant progress and transform Ukraine into a colony. 92 years, and if they continue losing 1,500 soldiers a day, that'll amount to something like 30 million soldiers in 92 years. Now, again, those are fantastic numbers. They don't reflect the reality, but they do give you a sense of the fact that Russia is pursuing a losing policy. Ukraine is consciously surrendering bits and pieces of territory while at the same time degrading Russia's armed forces. At this point already, Russia cannot find the appropriate number of soldiers to replace the 45,000 that they're losing on a monthly basis. So this war, from that point of view, is not sustainable for Russia. Within the next months, within the next year, perhaps sooner, perhaps a little later, they will literally run out of men and women, perhaps, in order to fill their ranks. They've already emptied prisons. I mean, there are almost no prisoners left. They were drafted a year and a half ago, and most of them have been killed. They're using the North Koreans, who have sent something like 11 to 12,000 soldiers to Russia. All of this signifies that Russia is losing. It's waging a war that is unsustainable militarily. Now, Ukraine has its own problems, of course, so I don't want to suggest that everything is fine on the Ukrainian side and everything is not fine on the Russian side. But the reality is that Russia is pursuing a war that is not sustainable. Things, to complicate things even more, the Russian economy is also unsustainable. Putin is devoting enormous resources to military production, which is producing some kinds of rockets, missiles, and things of that sort. And in the process, he's fueling hyperinflation as well as stagflation and stagnation. So Russian interest rates are extremely high. There is a very high labor shortage. The economy is contracting. Inflation, as I said, is enormous. The price of potatoes and eggs has doubled within the last few months. This is also unsustainable. And lots of Russian opposition economists, as well as official economists, opposition as well as official, emphasize that this is simply an unsustainable economic situation. Something has to change. And they hint at what the problem is, namely the fact that Putin is devoting so many resources to the military production sector. And they know that the solution is to stop doing that. But of course, that can only be done if the war is ended. But the problem for Putin is that he's committed so many lives. He's lost so many lives. He's transformed Russia into a Chinese colony. He's essentially set back Russia militarily as well as economically by decades. His career, his life, his political reality is so closely tied into the war that he can't simply say no. But there are Russians who insist that Russia should end the war as quickly as possible and then try to resume some kind of normal course of development. They're not in, some of them are actually in power. But at this point, Putin is still in charge. And as long as he's around, it's highly, highly unlikely that any kind of significant change will take place.
That's right, Dr. Motyl. Again, I agree with you 100%. At this moment, it's really hard to understand the next step that Putin is more likely to take. Now, let's bring US into our conversation. Now, recently, there's a piece appear on the Foreign Affairs and talk about the real risks of escalation in Ukraine. Now, I want to read a portion of the article and also want to get your reaction to this. Now, the writer and some believe that the current Biden administration overestimated the risk of escalation and underestimates just how hard it is to navigate red lines in a crisis and assess enemies' risk calculus. So in other words, that we know that throughout the entire Biden presidency, that U.S. has always been on the side of Ukraine, support Ukraine with the military weapons and also with the finance. But another perspective, the experts believe it is rather dangerous for U.S. to continue this path to support Ukraine. So in other words, in this upcoming year, it's very likely the U.S. it's going to get itself involved in the war in Ukraine and also create additional unnecessary trouble between U.S. and Russia at this moment. So, Dr. Motyl, I want to get your take on this. From your perspective, do you think that Biden administration or any sort of strategy that putting more effort into the war to support Ukraine and also offering more assistance to Ukraine could jeopardize the relationship between Russia and U.S. For the bigger picture? And also, do you think that it is time for U.S. to take another approach to look at the war in Ukraine? Your thoughts?
Well, keep in mind that the relationship between the United States and Russia has essentially deteriorated completely. So at this point in time, it's not a question of salvaging it. It's a question of It's a question of finding the sources of that deterioration and working on them. And the problem, as I said a number of times on your show, is quite simply Putin and Russia. Putin has an imperialist foreign policy program. He's already expanded. I mean, he's essentially transformed Belarus into a colony. He's still holding on to Transnistria. He's threatening Moldova. They continually threaten the Baltic states. There are threats to Georgia. And of course, there's the war in Ukraine. All this taken together clearly suggests that he has an imperial policy. And it's a policy that was sparked not by the possibility of NATO enlargement. NATO is essentially a paper tiger and had no plans whatsoever to incorporate Ukraine 3 years ago, or for that matter, even today. But it was all sparked by his imperial mentality, his imperialist ideology, which has its roots in Russian political culture. It has its roots in communist ideology. And it's also a form of policy that is pursued by dictators around the world in order to distract people from, problems at home. You engage in wars in order to get them involved and rally around the flag. So the responsibility for the deterioration in Russian-American relations is largely, if not indeed exclusively, due to Putin's behavior. If he didn't invade Ukraine, just imagine, there was no reason to invade Ukraine because Ukraine was not in anybody's plans was it going to be joining NATO. So there was no reason to invade. He could simply have maintained relatively good relations with Ukraine. 90% of Ukrainians thought positively of Russia 3 years ago. Many Ukrainians admired Putin. So there was no reason for this other than the fact that he wanted to expand his political control over a country that he believes shouldn't exist. So NATO is irrelevant, the West is irrelevant, the United States was largely irrelevant as well. So how does one fix the problem? One fixes the problem by addressing the source, the imperialism. Russian imperialism, or Putin's imperialism, if you like, has to be stopped. That's the only way to end the war. And that's the only way to bring back some form of normality in relations between the West and Russia and the world and Russia. And that means supporting Ukraine. That's really quite simple. I mean, one simply has to support Ukraine. There are things that don't entail offensive weapons. I mean, sometimes people get Ukraine has an arsenal of drones, which are very sophisticated. It's made enormous progress in that respect, and it's probably well advanced in comparison to its friends and allies in the West and other parts of the world. But it needs protection from Russian missiles. It needs the ability to shoot down missiles, rockets, and drones that have been destroying Ukrainian infrastructure, cities, hospitals, schools, as well as civilian population. That's not an escalation. That's humanitarian. And much of the world could easily provide that. Those weapons exist. They wouldn't affect the balance of power, but they would protect Ukrainians from Putin's genocidal plans. Now, maximally, Ukraine should be getting more assistance from the Europeans, from the Americans, and from the so-called Rammstein group in order to not just continue to degrade the Russian military, but actually to stop its expansion and perhaps even push it back. If and when that happens, and I personally believe that that will happen, then Putin will magically be forced to agree to some kind of deal. Until that happens, he is not going to agree to any kind of deal. He has to be taught a lesson, as do the Russian imperialists that support him. And as I said, it doesn't mean that American Marines have to land in Ukraine. It doesn't mean all Ukraine needs is the kind of support it's been getting and a bit more. And if it gets that, it will be able to defeat Russia.
Dr. Motyl, I want to end our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, 2025, we not only we're seeing the war in Ukraine, and also the entire international community, it's very concerned about this ongoing implication for the competition between US and China. And again, we don't know what will happen in either of the countries. And given the fact that two largest economies today are simply not getting along very well. I mean, despite we're seeing this political rhetoric, we're seeing this economic competition, and also the social conflicts as well. Now, but from your perspective, we're looking at Chinese government's reaction towards the war, and also we are seeing that China today is reacting to the presence of US on this international stage. So for your final question, how much can we still believe, or can we, what we say, I want to be careful, not the word to depend on China, but really to invite China to come to the table when we look at the war in Ukraine and when we look at the solution to Russia, given the fact that today we know that Russia and China are going to grow much closer, especially in this economic standpoint. So for this upcoming year, how do we assess the role of China, and how do we know from the Western perspective that China could or might help in order to de-escalate the tension or even the war in Ukraine? Your final thoughts.
Well, again, you outlined the problem very well. One of the good things one can say about China is that it appears to have played an important role in persuading Putin not to use nuclear weapons. And that's all to the credit of Beijing. There's no question about that. At the same time, as you know, I mean, the Chinese have been supporting the Russians. Apparently, they've been providing certain kinds of technologies. But equally important, they've essentially been exploiting the Russian economy. They're paying very low prices for energy. They are flooding the Russian market with Chinese products. I mean, virtually the Chinese cars have now essentially assumed dominance in the Russian market. So very rapidly what's taking place, it's not an alliance, because an alliance implies two equals. It's really a colonial relationship whereby the Chinese will dominate the Russian economy, and through that dominance, perhaps even be able to dominate Russia politically as well. It's not in Russia. Now, again, it's in the West's interest to wean China away from Russia. Because in effect, in attaching themselves to the Russians, the Chinese have, on the one hand, yes, they have access to energy resources at low prices. They can flood the market with Chinese products. But at the same time, they are possibly facing a geopolitical disaster. If I'm right about the balance of power between Russia and Ukraine, if I'm right in suggesting that Russia is losing and is likely to lose, then it's quite conceivable that the outcome will be massive instability within Russia. It could mean the downfall of the Putin regime. And then suddenly China is stuck with this so-called ally who is unstable, insecure, and possibly prone to all sorts of crazy actions. It would make much more sense geostrategically and economically for China and the United States, the two largest economies, as well as the two most powerful nations in the world, to cooperate, if that's at all possible, or in any case, to manage their competition in such a way that it doesn't lead to wars, bloodshed, fighting, but to keep it at a kind of relatively stable way. Now, it seems to me that the logic of the current situation is such that it will eventually push China away from Russia and towards the United States. But of course, a lot will depend on how the United States deals with China. And at that point, once we say that, we're now talking about the incoming Trump administration. And, given the kinds of statements that Mr. Trump has made in the last week or two, all bets are off. It's unclear what he's going to do about China. He may increase tariffs significantly. He may engage the Chinese in an economic war. At least his rhetoric suggests that that's the direction he's going to go into. But one never knows with Trump. He says one thing and does another. He contradicts himself continually, so we don't know what his policies will be. But if they turn out to be very punitive, then, of course, the Chinese will have no incentive to drift towards the United States. Even alternatively, there's a combination of some punitive measures, but an attempt to extend a hand. Who knows? At that point, everything is possible. So the prospect for American-Chinese relations is very uncertain. It's likely to get worse before it gets better, but you never know. We can only hope.
Yeah, of course, you're right, Dr. Motyl. I mean, again, at this moment, we don't know what President-elect Donald Trump is going to do with the war in Ukraine. And also, this is only the beginning of 2025. We're not seeing any reactions so far from the Chinese government side. But also, as the international community, we are equally concerned about the war in Ukraine. And I think that at the end of the day, no one would like to see the continuation of the war. And no one would like to see that Putin continue to build his imperial ambition or imperial isolation. I mean, again, it's not fair. I mean, you know, we said this many times. It's not fair for the citizens in Ukraine. And also, it's not acceptable for the citizens in Russia continue to see that how this war, it's really tearing the world apart. But anyway, so we're hoping for the best, and we hope that for 2025, we're going to receive some good news. Well, ladies and gentlemen, again, it's such an honor to speak to Dr. Alexander Motyl. Again, Dr. Motyl, it's a professor of political science. He's a specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and the USSR, and he's the author of 10 books of nonfiction, and including the one called Imperial Ends, and the Decay, Collapse, and the Revival of Empires. Well, Dr. Motyl, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and we're looking forward to having more conversation with you this year. It's not just about Ukraine, not about China, but also about the matters around the world. And again, we really appreciate your time, and thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure, Will, as always. And thank you to your audience for listening to me. Well, and perhaps even agreeing, but in any case, thank you for your attention.